I think we're all wrong about Loki. We have misjudged him. Loki's introduction to the series has been, well, it's giving mixed messages. Is he a hero? Is he a bad guy? How do we make sense of some of the very conflicting things that we have been presented about this character? Well, I'm gonna try solve this mystery, so please help me out. The few pieces of information that we were given about Prince Loki prior to chapter 1130 made it seem like Loki was actually quite a good guy. I know silhouettes can be pretty misleading in One Piece. Loki is just the latest example of a goofy silhouette turning out to be quite the awesome or quite the ferocious figure. But one key detail that I think, or at least I had always thought, something that I thought was quite symbolic was Loki with a flower. For me, this seemed to indicate that Loki was a good guy. He's innocent, he's of a sweet, kind nature. You know, as if he's a hopeless romantic. He fell in love with Charlotte Lola at first sight and proposed to her despite the fact that she was the daughter of Elbaf's one of most hated enemies. And that to me suggested that he was capable of putting behind a decades-old grudge for the sake of love. When Big Mom tried to pass off Lola's identical twin, Chiffon, as his new bride, Loki saw through the plot. He knew the difference. And that to me suggested multiple things. He's not some Machiavellian who, like Big Mom, was just using this marriage as some sort of political ploy. He wasn't just trying to find a way in to gain control of Big Mom's fearsome Yonko crew. He also wasn't superficially into Lola. He loved her for who she was and not just her looks. And then the fact that the Elbafians, alongside Loki, they were also willing to bury the hatchet, get over their long-held hatred for Big Mom, despite what she did to their home, despite what she did to their hero. Well, I thought that really indicated that the Elbafians truly loved and revered and respected their prince. You know, they respected him enough to honor his decision to marry one of Big Mom's daughters. And when her trick involving the twin sisters were revealed, they were rightfully very angry at Big Mom. You know, they got angry on behalf of Loki. And this response isn't something that you would expect from a country that saw Loki as their big shame. This isn't the sort of response, it's not the sort of support you would expect from a people, from a citizen, or a group of citizens that saw Loki as this great evil that needs to be contained. Whereas, the introduction that we actually get to Loki in chapter 1130, well, that completely turns everything I thought I knew about Loki on its head. Loki is considered Elbaf's shame. He's been sentenced to crucifixion. Now, of course, this ordeal involving Big Mom and Lola happened quite a number of years ago. We don't have an exact date, but we do know that Lola arrived at Thriller Bark 5 years ago after running away from her home. But even before then, we know that she had been traveling for some time with her crew. She'd gone around the Grand Line, even made her way to Fishman Island. And also, if we look at the farewell panel between Lola and Pudding, it seems like Pudding is around 10 years old here. Perhaps even younger. And so if she's 16 years old now, I would estimate that these events involving Loki and Lola's failed engagement, their failed marriage, I would say that happened around 6 to 10 years ago. And so what this tells us then is that up until this point, up to the point of Loki and Lola's engagement, Prince Loki was, for all intents and purposes, he was a well-liked and revered prince. He wasn't considered Elbaf's shame back then. And whatever has happened, what's occurred to shift Elbaf's perception of him, that's happened in the more recent years. Which then led me to think, well, how recent? And again, let's work this through together. So it seems to me that Loki's supposed murder of his own father, King Harold, that's something that happened in the last couple of years. They explain that it's something that happened when Dory and Brogy were away, and that isn't super helpful because they've been gone for over a century. And it's not quite clear when Oimo and Kashi brought them back to Elbaf, but it must have only been in the last year or so, potentially even in the last few months, because in the cover story series from the decks all around the world, and this is a cover story series that took place following the time skip, we saw that Dory and Brogy were still at Little Garden, still continuing their 100-year duel. So then let's try use some of the other information that we have. One of the key reveals, I think, from chapter 1130 is that Hadruddin, he is also a prince. He seems to be Prince Loki's older brother. And that really led me to think, because if Hadrodin was allowed to go and form the new giant warrior pirates, you would assume that he was only allowed to do so because the Elbaf kingdom trusted in their other prince, aka Loki. They trusted Loki to take on the role of the Prince of Elbaf, while his older brother, the firstborn, supposed firstborn, was allowed to roam free because Prince Loki would remain at home, he would remain in the kingdom, ruling or at least learning how to rule at the castle. And this is a bit of an assumption without knowing all that much about Elbafian politics, without knowing much of their royal customs. But I think it makes sense, right? Because King Harold, he doesn't seem to have been part of the giant warrior pirates, and I would assume that that's not because he's not strong enough to be. For a kingdom of warriors, you would have to assume that their king also has to be strong. So it's just more likely that he wasn't sailing around the seas, he wasn't freely going around traveling with the pirates, because his role is back at the castle. His role is as king to rule. And then so you would think that if he had an heir, that heir would also most likely not be allowed to go and roam the seas, because that prince's role would also be to undergo some royal training, royal tutelage to take on and be primed to be the next king. And again, because we don't know much about Elbafian royal customs, while I can't say for sure that the title of royalty would pass down one family line, maybe you could even argue that as a nation of warriors, the giants would actually have to battle and fight so that they could claim the title of king. But if we look at the term Elbaf royal line that was actually used in chapter 1130, I would say that that's referring to one family line. And then so I would say that either one of King Harold's sons would have been considered the next royal heir. And then that has me thinking, well, it's pretty customary, usually. It's pretty customary for the firstborn or the older one to be considered next in line. So then why would Hadrodin, the older of the two, be allowed to go sail the seas and go become a pirate? And so interestingly enough, if you actually go back and if you go back to see the way that Elbafians refer to Hadrodin or the way that they treat him, you wouldn't even be able to tell that he's a royal, which is fair enough because we only did find out in chapter 1130 that he is in fact of royal heritage. And I would argue that there really wasn't many clues to suggest that he was royal at all. In chapter 866, other children feel comfortable calling him the wild child. That's not a very respectful term. In chapter 1130, the older giants, they call him a brat. Again, not very respectful towards your prince. And yeah, maybe you could say that's just part of the giant warrior culture. Royals, they're not babied, they're not treated with as much respect or reverence. The whole Elbafian culture and custom, it's more brutal, more egalitarian. I don't know, less pompous, less pretentious. But when you take everything into account, I just can't help but think that Hadrodin was passed over when it came to becoming the next king. The fact that Hadrodin is a prince doesn't seem to be common knowledge outside of Elbaf. Big Mom sought to solidify her political power through Prince Loki, the seemingly official prince. When Hadrodin is introduced much earlier in the series, we're never told that he's a prince. It never comes up during the interactions with the Buggy's delivery. And so what it seems to me, at least, is that it seems that King Harold and I guess Elbaf, they looked to Loki to become the next king. And again, that begs the question, why? And if we choose to forget the more recent information from chapter 1130 for the time being, I think it's because that of these two heirs, Loki was actually the more even-tempered, the nicer, the more benevolent prince. Like I said at the beginning of today's discussion, everything we've been shown up until chapter 1130 suggested that Loki is actually a good guy. sky. Hadrodin is the wild, tempestuous prince, whereas Loki, he's the sweet and loving prince. So then what happened? What changed? Why is Loki Elbaf's shame now? Now I have a few theories, but before I share my thoughts, I would really appreciate it if you guys could click the subscribe button. I'm on a mission to reach 100k subscribers and I need your help doing so. You can also take this time now to like the video and also leave your comments below on what you think happened to Loki or on who you really think Loki is inside. Okay, so like I said, I have a few ideas. The first one centers around Oda's focus on Rodo. This fake sun god was probably a most unexpected surprise for our entry into the Elbaf arc. And Rodo is obviously actually quite an important character. I have to admit that I actually completely forgot this guy existed. Whereas now I think he's super important and that Oda had always meant for him to be quite important. And you know why I think that? It's because Oda actually introduced him alongside Loki. In chapter 866, we find out that Loki and Rodo were actually born in the same year, and so was Goldberg for that matter. But it seems that Oda is clearly playing on some parallel characterization for these two figures. They are two supposed sun gods of Elbaf. Their names were brought up right alongside each other all the way back in Big Mom's flashback. They're both considered Elbaf shame. In chapter 1130, Gerd actually comments that Loki isn't the shame of Elbaf, or at least in her opinion, Loki isn't the shame of Elbaf, Rodo is. And after reading the entire chapter, I thought those were some pretty strong words. Loki killed your king. This is a guy that murdered his own father and murdered your royal sovereign. You're going to equate Rodo being on that same level just because you find him creepy, because you find him weird? Look, I might be reading way too much into this, but I think that piece of dialogue actually points to much more. That there's something weird going on between Loki and Rodo. There's a reason why Oda has decided to make them sort of mirror each other. Obviously not in terms of design because, you know, Loki looks sick. And look, I just haven't fully fleshed it out yet, but I think it could have something to do with like a mistaken identity, maybe some sort of misunderstanding of some sort. Maybe you guys can help me flesh it out, but for the time being, we're gonna move on to my second idea. And this idea is actually based on another curious piece of dialogue. The fact that Loki is also known as the Accursed Prince. This is actually a very important detail, and we know it must be an important detail because it's actually the title of chapter 1130. And we have to unpack this further because I think that being called the Accursed Prince is quite different to being considered Elbaf shame. That second nickname, Elbaf shame, that's been given to Loki because of his supposed active actions in getting up to no good. Whereas on the other hand, being called cursed, that suggests something being done to you. That suggests a level of passivity, perhaps even a level of sympathy. And this name, this epithet, seems to be something that Loki has been known for quite some time. I would say it most likely predates to his actions of murdering King Harold. And I think it's actually also very significant because when I did some digging, it seems that there is a real-life mythological figure who is often called the Accursed Prince. And this figure also just so happens to be importantly related to the Norse god Loki. And this is the story of Prince Balder, one of Odin's sons. So Prince Balder is said to have been a favorite amongst all the gods. He was known to have been of a good and righteous nature. Balder is also most well known for not having been able to physically feel anything. Nothing in the world except for mistletoe could affect him, could hurt him. This was due to a spell that was cast by his mother. But this spell that was supposedly supposed to protect him, that tragically turned out to be a curse. Reason being because the trickster god Loki, he used this to his advantage and tricked Balder's own brother to shoot him with mistletoe, eventually killing Balder, the Accursed Prince. And Balder's death would be one of the catalysts for the Ragnarok, the great war that's going to bring about the end of the Norse world. And immediately, I think we can all agree that there are some similarities or connections that we can make to the series from this Norse tale. But here's how I'm choosing to interpret this real-life inspiration. I think Oda has chosen to amalgamate these multiple Norse figures into his creation of his Loki. I think that Loki is made up of both Balder, the cursed but good prince, the prince who was favored by all, as well as the original Norse god Loki, the trickster god, the evil one, the god of a very duplicitous nature. And this is my idea of Oda's conception for his Loki. Loki was by nature a very good, a very virtuous prince by birth. He was therefore the favored one, and the king as well as the kingdom supported him in becoming the next heir. And again, this seems to be supported by all accounts that we've received of Loki up until chapter 1130. However, he was also cursed, and I don't think the curse referred to him killing his father, although potentially it might have, or at least been related to it. I think the curse was probably laid on him much earlier, and I think it's interesting that we have this idea of a curse, because curse or this existence seems to also be very closely related to the idea of fate. And fate is also a very important concept in Norse mythology as well as in One Piece. And I actually have an entire video discussing key Norse mythological concepts and figures and how they relate to Elbaf or the entire One Piece series. I go through concepts like fate, like the Ragnarok, Yggdrasil, the World Tree, all of it, so I highly recommend you go and watch that video. But from chapter 1130, it seems like there is this idea of fate, or at least prophecies, that is present in Elbaf. The giant warriors seem to almost prophesize that when Loki is unleashed into the world, he is going to cause havoc. He's going to cause and bring the world to ruin. Loki himself says that he's the one that's going to bring the world to an end. And I think that that is actually what the curse entails. Loki has been cursed to be the harbinger of the world's doom. And when you think about it, that sounds to be awfully similar to another prophecy that we've heard about another sun god. Wouldn't you say that Luffy also being prophesied to bring about the ruin of Fishman Island sounds very similar? And we all know that Luffy isn't evil. And in fact, don't we actually want this world to come to an end? Isn't that Luffy's whole role and whole point as the sun god Nika, to bring about the new dawn? You know, we at least want the current world system to come to an end. This current world system ruled by Imu, propped up by the world government, a world government that hides the truth of its political system, keeps its citizens in the dark ages, goes around killing an entire population, culling entire islands on a whim. We want this world to come to an end. Isn't that why we're all excited, or at least expecting Luffy to actually unleash Loki? Unleash Loki and start the Ragnarok, because we want that great war and we want to bring about a new dawn. But I think we still have to resolve one last puzzle, and that is Loki's murder of his father. Because, you know, no matter which way you look at it, that does seem evil. If Loki murdered his father, that's pretty cold-blooded. I don't know how you go about justifying that, but this is manga, anime after all. Everyone can be redeemed. So let's unpack Loki's supposed murder of his own father, the late King Harold. So this seems to be Loki's unforgivable, evil act, the one that has resulted in him being called Elbaf shame, as well as justifying his crucifixion. And it's said that the reason why Loki killed his father was to inherit this legendary devil fruit that has been passed down his family, the royal family, for generations. Except here lies a contradiction, or multiple contradictions. The first is that, depending on which way you look at it, this seems to go against what we have known about devil fruits, or at least adds a new layer, is a little off about what we've known of devil fruits. If King Harold was the owner and the user of this legendary devil fruit, how does killing him, how would that automatically result in Loki coming in possession of that devil fruit? You know, that doesn't seem to work with what we currently know of how devil fruit regeneration works, which is that when someone who is a devil fruit user dies, that devil fruit will regenerate, and maybe the devil fruit will regenerate close by, as we have seen in previous cases, but it reappears somewhere else, and it's not like a fixed time or place, because it seems to just transform another nearby fruit. So then maybe that actually means that Harold didn't possess the devil fruit power. He wasn't the devil fruit user. Maybe he just, maybe he just had the devil fruit in his possession. In which case, a second contradiction. Why would Loki have needed to kill his father for the devil fruit? We already know that that fruit gets passed down the royal family through generations. By his birthright, especially if he was the next heir, Loki would have eventually inherited that legendary devil fruit. Was Loki just really that impatient, and did he decide that he needed that fruit then and there? Did he need the fruit at a particular moment in time? And if so, why? And so when I started thinking about this, well, then I can't help but think that maybe it goes back to that prophecy. Maybe Loki knew that he had to gain the powers of that legendary devil fruit in order to fulfill his prophecy, in order to fulfill his curse, his destiny, his fate. If he's going to bring about the end of the world as the almighty sun god, he needs a legendary devil fruit power to do so. And here's the thing about fate and destiny in Norse mythology. It can't be undone. They always come true. Now, this doesn't mean they are 100% determinative and gets rid of free will. Like I said, I do go into the concept of fate in Norse mythology in that other video. But for example, a reason why a prophecy might not be 100% determinative is that it might tell you what will happen, how it will happen, but it might not tell you when something will happen. For example, Ragnarok. Ragnarok is actually an event that hasn't occurred in Norse mythology yet, but it is prophesied to occur, and so we all know that it will 100% occur, but we don't know when. And a lot of Norse mythology, a lot of Odin's actions in particular, the Norse god or Father Odin's actions, is to try delay or is to try prevent actions that will bring about Ragnarok from occurring. But if we then apply this to One Piece, if we apply this to Loki, because fate, because prophecies are always known to come true, I think this might mean that maybe King Harold was always aware that Prince Loki would eventually kill him one day. Maybe he even accepted this fact, maybe he welcomed or allowed Loki to do so. He didn't bear Loki any ill will for realizing and fulfilling his prophecy, because it was an event that they all knew would eventually occur almost outside of Loki's control. I mean, this is the brutal world of giant warriors after all. One of the first things that we ever found out about Elbaf was this no-nonsense, tough and violent but honorable way of living. A giant warrior's code that they lived by. And this is exactly how Dory and Broggy were introduced. They're in this 100-year-old death match just to settle a question of honor or of strength, of bravery. And this is actually how Dory explains it. In my village, we lived by a code. When there's a dispute and neither side will yield, the god of Elbaf decides the matter. Our god protects the one who is right and lets him live. Whoever is right will win the battle and live. And so reading this explanation, maybe this is actually what happened instead. Maybe Loki and Harold didn't see eye to eye about Loki's prophecy, about his place and his role in the world. Loki knew that he was prophesied, that he was destined to bring about the end of the world. This is something that he saw as having to happen, needing to happen. And he knew that in order for him to fulfill this prophecy, that he would need this legendary devil fruit. Whereas King Harold, the king, disagreed. Maybe he saw this prophecy, maybe he saw it as the curse. It's a curse that needed to be prevented, it needed to be fought and resisted at all costs. And so this meant that Harold refused to pass down his legendary devil fruit, the one that has been getting passed down through all the generations of Elbafian kings, because he didn't want Loki to be that person who is going to bring the world's downfall. He didn't want that for his son. And so this is a conflict that neither side would yield from. And so instead, the father and son one engage in a battle, they decide that they will allow the god of Elbaf to decide who is right, and we know how it goes. Loki's the one that prevails, killing his father in the process, taking the devil fruit for himself. But maybe the fact that this was actually an honorable battle, that Loki righteously won as per the laws, as per the rules and customs of the Elbafian code, maybe that wasn't common knowledge to Elbafians. They don't see it as this honorable battle, and instead the kingdom just sees it as a bloody act of murder. Hence why Loki has been tied up, he has been chained, he's been sentenced to crucifixion, and this all is a big misunderstanding. Now, those are just some of my ideas. Essentially, that Loki is one part of a prophecy that has resulted in him being misjudged, mischaracterized, falsely sentenced to death, whereas he's actually just playing his role in an important world event that has to occur. Another key detail that I think relates to all of this is the giant sword at Elbaf. I can't help but think that this is awfully similar to the giant sword that we saw back at Onigashima. That sword was never explained by the end of the Wano arc, not to mention that Onigashima is actually shaped like a giant skull, complete with, the horns that they all wear, and not to mention that Wano itself is also very closely related to another similar prophecy, one about the coming of a new dawn. Anyways, I think these connections probably require more thinking, more discussing in a video of its own, so we'll save it for a next time, as well as a discussion on what will Loki's legendary devil fruit be. Well, you can let me know your thoughts by leaving a comment below. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, please do like the video. Again, please do subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I'm convinced that King Harold was a bad guy. Loki is just the pawn in a wider Elbaf conspiracy, and my job by the end of this video is to convince you of the same. So for a while now, I've been feeling that things at Elbaf aren't quite as they seem, and chapter 1140 more or less confirmed that for me. I feel like I'm almost being lied to, as if at least I'm getting tricked. Things we've been told about Elbaf, or since we've arrived at Elbaf, just don't quite line up. But because of all of these massive lore reveals, so many hype character introductions, all of these unexpected twists and turns, I think Oda has very cleverly, very successfully kept us from probing too deep into some of these inconsistencies. And let me tell you, there are some serious inconsistencies. So this is my attempt to work out and work through some of these contradictions. I'm going to offer my thoughts on what I really think is going on, and like I said, I'm making it my mission to convince you as well. But before we get into it, please take a quick second and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate your help. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers. Okay, now let's get straight into it. So first of all, here are some of the contradictions I've noticed. It said that the late King Harold wanted peace and diplomacy, but something that I've always found quite strange is that he didn't seem to focus, or he didn't seem to try fix the bigotry that exists within the Elbafians. For someone who wanted peace, he didn't prioritize brokering peace between the different giant races. And I thought that this was even stranger, considering that the mother of his own child was of another giant race. For someone who is praised as the great and wise king, the best king in all of Elbaf's history, he let his own lover get tormented. That's the word they use, torment. And we're seriously to believe that this is a man who is principled enough to get into conflict with all the great chieftains throughout Elbaf. He's willing to go through that in order to transform Elbaf's culture away from their warrior heritage, but he wouldn't stand up to the chieftains for the woman who bore his own child. He wouldn't stick to his guns and say, accept her as my queen. And let's even unpack the reason why the Elbafians wouldn't accept her as queen. So as we found out in this arc, Elbafians care a lot about race mixing between giants. They think of it as being dishonorable, as if it's tainting their blood. But the king that they loved so much, their royal ruler himself, was of mixed heritage. King Harold was of mixed giant blood. He wasn't purely Elbafian because it said that he also derived from the ancient giants. Now, I guess on one hand, maybe the Elbafians didn't care about race mixing if it was with the ancient giant race. I could see that happening because they're the Elbafians, they're warriors, and ancient giants are the greatest, the biggest, the toughest. I guess it might have even been a source of honor or pride that you are related to the ancient giants. But then then, hang on a second. Now they're trying to distance themselves away from their violent and warring ways anyways? And then also, despite being opposed to tainting their blood with non-Elbafian giant blood, they don't seem to care about race mixing with other species, with other non-giant species. We've seen the Watun, and we've also now seen Colin, the offspring of a giant mother and a human father. And look, Colin does seem to be a bit of an outcast compared to the rest of the giant kids, but it seems to be more because of his personality rather than the fact that he's not purely Elbafian. I mean, after all, there's actually a bit of a human fetish throughout all of Elbaf in general. So where's the logic in caring about your blood purity when it comes to giant races, but not when it comes to other species? Something else that I found really strange is that Elbaf is a land of warriors. They live by a set and structured code on what it means to be a brave warrior. And yet, after their king died, after their king was brutally murdered, and all of their soldiers slain, instead of organizing and holding a funeral or some sort of burial rites to honor the dead, they just left all the dead soldiers to just rot and decompose. These soldiers who supposedly fought honorably trying to protect their king. And what's even more, now, because of this giant graveyard, this seems to have resulted in an almost old wives' tale, some sort of superstitions about the castle being haunted, which I guess actually in one way could fit sort of the very superstitious mindset of the original Vikings in our real world, the very superstitious mindset that existed in the Middle Ages. But then on the other hand, it just doesn't seem to fit that image of the very brave and fearsome warrior. And then now let's take a look at the timeline, because some of the timeline doesn't even make sense. So we know that historically, Elbaf was the warrior kingdom. It was called Warland Elbaf. But supposedly, King Harold one day decided to bring an end to this warring, brutal way of life. Rather than being known for violence, he wanted Elbaf known for peace. He wanted Elbaf to establish trade ties with its neighboring countries. And according to Miss Ripley, King Harold brought an end to this fighting culture 100 years ago. This is when the reforms started, 100 years ago. She says that she, as an 80-year-old giant, is the last, or is part of the last generation of warriors. But then if these reforms were introduced 100 years ago, why is this the first time we're hearing of it? How has this news not spread further outside of Elbaf? To the outside world, Elbaf has always been known as the land of warriors. There has been no mention that they've tried to establish peace with its neighbors. No news that the Warland is actually now trying to set up trade relations. As far as we know, Elbaf has always retained its reputation as a warrior nation. And sure, let's try to give it the benefit of doubt. Let's say that as a nation that is currently unaffiliated with the world government, news travels slowly. But surely not that slowly, right? I mean, 100 years has passed. Not to mention that during this period, there have been plenty of opportunities where this news could have spread. The greatest example that I can think of is via Mother Carmel. So during this 100-year period, Mother Carmel set up her operations, her orphanage at Elbaf. And knowing what we know about the truth of Mother Carmel's operations, surely if it was known within the kingdom that Elbaf was no longer going to be Warland Elbaf, surely that's something that Mother Carmel would have passed on to the outside world. Surely this is exactly the type of information that she would pass on to the world government. And then let's actually consider what's even changed within Elbaf, because it seems like the culture within Elbaf hasn't changed all that much in the past 100 years. It really seems like it's only now, with the generation of the current kids, this new generation, that they're finally starting to adopt this new way of life. Even Miss Ripley, who seems pretty positive about this reformation in general, she's quite wistful about Elbaf's legendary past. She personally still acts very brutish and very warrior-like, and it actually even seems like she and Scopper made an active decision not to raise Colin in the new way of life. Colin is almost praised and encouraged to still live and behave like a warrior. And look, maybe that's just because of Gaban's influence, you know, he's a very fearsome pirate, the Mountain Eater. But even as a nation, I would actually say that the Elbafians as a whole still seem to embrace very powerful, brave people. They embrace people like Shanks. They still worship and recognize Jarul as a hero. The Elbafians still cheer. Even both the original warrior pirates and the new giant warrior pirates, they're still loved by their community. It's not like the Elbafians look at these men, look at these old generation and consider them history, consider them a past generation whose antics has overstayed its welcome. It still feels like being a warrior is very fundamental at the very core of the Elbafian identity. And look, I get it, when a certain type of culture has been instilled in you for so long, it's not easy to replace overnight, but I do think something doesn't quite add up here because again, hello, 100 years has passed. 100 years since the reform started, and during that period, the new giant warrior pirates were formed. Why would King Harold even allow that to happen? Why would he allow his own son to start a new pirate crew named the Warrior Pirates? Doesn't that go against the very image, go against the very reputation that he is now trying to move the country away from? Why did he not try to convince his son? Why don't you change your name? Why don't you change it to the new giant trading pirates? The new friendly giant pirates. Even when we look back 63 years ago, when King Harold was still very much alive, when the whole process of reforming Elbaf was taking place, we can see that kids are actually still being trained in the warrior way. Why not decree that all kids from now on will go to school and stop learning how to become warriors? Was it really such a slow process? Was King Harold really that afraid of the backlash that all he tried was to employ soft power when he was making these reforms? To me, it doesn't really make sense, but let's look at another timeline inconsistency. So we now know that King Harold was killed 14 years ago, which then starts to raise, when did Lola's betrothal, when did Loki and Lola's engagement take place amidst all of this? Because we don't know when exactly Loki proposed to Lola, but I would have thought that this incident, this engagement happened a lot more recently than 14 years ago. I mean, think about it, Lola is only 26 years old. Surely she would have been older than 12 when Loki proposed. Especially because we also saw Lola's farewell to Pudding before she escaped, before she left and ran away. And Pudding is only 16 years old now. So if it happened before King Harold's death, that means that at the oldest, Pudding would have only been 2 when Lola left. And come on, look at this flashback. There is no way that that's a 2-year-old Pudding. So then before you go and say, well, the engagement could have always happened after Loki killed his father and ran away. It happened after Loki became a pirate and started to sail the seas. Well, I'd have to beg to differ because we were explicitly told that by Lola breaking off the engagement, and because Big Mom tried to trick the Elbafians and pass on Chiffon as Lola, this is what made the Elbafians even angrier at Big Mom. And let's actually take a look at the specific language used here, shall we? Chiffon says, they realized that I wasn't Lola, and things got even worse with giants. Not just that Loki realized that she wasn't Lola, but they, collectively, the Elbafians. This whole dialogue, this whole passage feels very much as if the entire kingdom was very involved, very invested in this engagement. That the outcome, Big Mom's treachery, this angered the Elbafians as a nation, as a kingdom. And I just don't think that that would quite make sense if the Elbafians didn't really care about Loki anymore. Why would they be so enraged on his behalf? Why would they have been willing to make peace with Big Mom for Loki's sake when they don't even like or respect Loki anymore? When they don't really recognize him as a true prince? I guess the one caveat could be that this was the Elbafians' own political ploy. Maybe they were trying to use this engagement to try capture Loki. But I have to say, I don't know, I feel like that's a little too convoluted, and the Elbafians don't quite strike me as the political masterminds who would try to come up with plans and schemes like this. And the other alternative that I could think of is that when Chiffon is saying they, maybe she's not referring to the Elbafians as a whole, and maybe she's only referring to Loki and Loki's pirate crew. Maybe they turned against Big Mom even more on behalf of their captain. But we don't even actually know whether Loki had a proper pirate crew. Anyways, all of this is just to say that there is something seriously afoot here at Elbaf. Things aren't making sense. Someone is lying. And you can let me know if you think I'm reading way too deep into things. But I'm very sure that I'm not the only one who is suspecting there is a conspiracy going on. So then based on these inconsistencies, here are some of my thoughts. I'm now convinced of 3 things. 1. Loki is not a bad guy. He's being used as a pawn in someone else's game. 2. King Harold was not the model Elbafian king as he's claimed to be. I think King Harold was actually working with the world government. And 3, these first 2 premises. These are currently coming to a head at Elbaf, and this is what's going to drive us into the Ragnarok, into the final war, the great war, the climax of the series. So let's start with this first idea. Now, if you've been around this channel for a while now, you'll know that I have long been saying Loki is not a bad guy. He's not evil like he's being painted out to be. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then I'll link those videos. But basically, I think what we knew about Loki from even before the Elbaf arc, the fact that he was this romantic, the fact that he truly cared for Lola, I think it was clear that he wasn't such a bad guy. And then ever since meeting him at Elbaf, I think the more we see, the more we get to realize he's really not all that bad. We've seen Loki display kindness to Shaggy or to Mosa, depending on which translation you're reading. We also see that he actually truly cares about his friends in the underworld. He's rejected becoming one of the gods' knights and becoming a celestial dragon. He calls the celestial dragons scum. And knowing what we know about the celestial dragons, I think we can get very much on board with that. And can I just say that Loki turning out to be not evil is actually just so classic One Piece. We've seen this happen time and time again. We saw it happen with Robin, the demon child, actually turning out to be just the victim of the O'Haran incident. We also saw it even more recently with Kuma the tyrant, who is not actually a tyrant at all. So Loki, the accursed prince who's going to bring about the doom of Elbaf? Yeah, I don't think so. Or at least it's not that simple. Yes, he's violent and he wants to destroy the world. He's said that multiple times. But destroying the world, as we know, is not such a bad thing. We're wanting the world to be destroyed. We want this current world to be destroyed so that a fairer world can exist. A fairer world can be established. That's exactly what we're waiting for Luffy to do. To destroy this current world, destroy its current world systems, the world government, and we want Luffy to bring about the new dawn. So that's the first part, right? Loki isn't evil. Instead, he's being used as a pawn by both sides to bring about the Ragnarok. And when I say both sides, I'm referring to the world government and the Roger Pirates. So let's start with the world government. Or rather, it's the world government and his own father, the late King Harold. If Loki is the perfect example of yet another good character who has been initially portrayed as being evil, then King Harold is the exact opposite. Now, I've already listed some things about King Harold that doesn't quite line up, some things that makes King Harold a little suspect. But chapter 1140 is what really nailed the coffin for me. In chapter 1140, the God's Knights spoke as if they are already familiar with King Harold. They ask, why are we here in Elbaf? Are we here to visit King Harold's tomb? And that to me sounds really strange because visiting someone's gravesite, that sounds like a show of respect. In fact, the only instances we've seen this happen in the series are when characters go to the gravesites of their friends or of people that they've respected in the past. We've seen this with Shanks, we've seen this with Sabo, we've seen this with Gyukimaru, protecting the gravesites of his loved one. All these cases, there's this pre-existing connection, a relationship of friendship or a relationship of respect. But even before chapter 1140, I think there have been little hints. So one of the most major reveals in the Elbaf arc has been our introduction to Shanks' evil twin brother, Figureland Shamrock. And I have to say, initially, I thought that the God's Knights' intervention at Elbaf, their attempt to try and recruit Loki, was a result of the Supreme Commander, Figureland Garling being promoted to Gorosei, thereby leaving a gap within the God's Knights that they had to fill. But then I went back and I reread all of Elbaf and even the ending of the Egghead Island arc, and I actually realized that the plan to infiltrate Elbaf has been in stone, has been set in place for a while now. In chapter 1125, when the Vice Admirals suggest that they go after the Straw Hats to Elbaf, Saint Saturn, may he not rest in peace, he tells the Vice Admirals, don't bother. Says, don't bother, don't go chasing the crew. And back then, I thought Saturn said that because he just considered the Elbafian giants too strong. He thought, after they've already lost at Egghead, they would be expending too much energy, too much risk in going after the Straw Hats and the giants. Whereas now I think the reason why Saint Saturn told them don't bother is because he knew that there was already a plan in motion to go infiltrate and to go bring Elbaf under the power of the world government. So he really figured there was no need. And then this seems to be supported in chapter 1136. Because in chapter 1136, we see a conversation between Shamrock and Gunko. And according to Gunko, it seems that the God's Knights had already sent out agents to go spy on Elbaf and report information back to them. Which again seems to confirm or at least suggest this idea that this plan has been in place for a while now. Likely even before the giant warriors came to save Luffy at Egghead, even before Saturn was killed and Garling replaced him as one of the Gorosei. And at first I wondered, did the God's Knights just kill Harold themselves and then frame Loki for the murder? Did they know that leaving Elbaf without a leader would cause some instability, make it easier for them to infiltrate? And look, I won't rule that out completely, but the more that I think about it and the more I think about King Harold's strangeness, his little suspicious activities, I am now more inclined to say King Harold himself was in on the plan. King Harold was working with the world government. King Harold was trying to bring Elbaf under world government control, or world government affiliation. But of course, with the rich history of Elbaf, as a strong warrior nation, a nation that has deep ties to the lore that concerns the world, with their partial knowledge of what happened in the previous eras, he knew that it wouldn't be so easy to weaken the spirit of the warriors. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince them, hey, we should become affiliated with the world government. So what does he do instead? He starts his reformation to distance Elbaf from its warrior past. He wants to strip Elbaf of its true culture. Now, why King Harold wanted to do this, I have a couple of ideas. The most straightforward, the easiest ones, is that he made a deal. Maybe like York, maybe King Harold wanted to become one of the celestial dragons himself. Maybe he wanted to become immortal like the Gorosei. Or maybe this was his own way of getting revenge on the Elbafians who scorned his lover after the torment that Harridan's mother endured. Maybe King Harold decided Elbaf isn't a noble country that deserves saving or protection. They deserve punishment instead. Maybe he thought stripping them of their warrior ways would make them more likely to accept her as his queen. Or maybe this was just simply King Harold's own twisted interpretation of the Harley. Maybe he genuinely believed that he was doing the right thing by bringing Elbaf under world government affiliation. I mean, after all, Jirul does actually say that perhaps both Loki and King Harold were both living out their own interpretations of what Nika represent. Either way, I think this way, we can recontextualize everything we thought we knew about Loki and what we thought we knew about King Harold. When it comes to the patricide, yes, I do believe that Loki did in fact kill his own father, but he did so not out of greed or unfettered ambition. Loki just must have caught on to what his father was doing and challenged him. That must be the reason why Oda showed us the transportation portal right on the castle floor, to show us that the God's Knights, the world government, has been in frequent contact with the royal kingdom. Perhaps one day Loki came into the castle, found the God's Knights dealing with his father. In which case, unwilling to let Elbaf fall into the hands of the world government, unwilling to let his own father betray their kingdom, Loki engages King Harold in battle. Lord Jirul gets involved, unaware of the bigger picture, just thinks Loki's out here attacking his king. So Jirul gets involved, tries to protect his king, and just as Loki is about to reveal his father's dark, sinister plan, King Harold stabs Jirul. The reason I say this is because come look at this portrait of King Harold. Focus particularly on his sword. Look at that curved hilt of the sword. Look at the shape. Now look at the sword that's lodged in Lord Jarul's head. Try and tell me that these two are not the same swords. In which case, then why does Jarul blame Loki for what happened to his head? Well, seeing as the sword has been stabbed into Jarul's head, it's possible that he could have some sort of partial memory loss. Or maybe because it was a wild, chaotic battle, it was a confusing scuffle, it seemed like Loki stabbed Jarul even though it was actually King Harold. Or maybe King Harold was actually trying to stab Loki, but Jarul got in the way, and Jarul, not wanting to complicate things further, just said this was Loki because he saw Loki as the instigator of the entire battle. But again, the whole thing is just a great big misunderstanding. In fact, I think it's even possible that everything Loki has been blamed for throughout his life has been the event or has been the result of big misunderstandings. Isn't it interesting that they say that whenever King Harold was away, Loki made the Elbafians' lives a living hell? It seems that bad things happened when King Harold was away. And initially it seems to mean that that's because that's when Loki would act up, that's when he would misbehave. But it's even possible that actually what King Harold was doing was going away and plotting things, doing things in the shadows, in the dark, to try and sabotage Elbaf. But it was Loki that was being blamed for what was happening. Ever since we were introduced to Loki's so-called dangerous nature, I really couldn't help but feel that this was so Odin-esque. And just as Odin was misunderstood by the citizens of Wano that he was protecting from the shadows in secret, I just feel like we're getting a very similar situation with Loki. Anyways, once Loki killed King Harold, the world government's plans fell apart. Until recently, they tried to change the tactic, try to get Loki on their side instead. I mean, it worked for his father, so why not try with the son? But obviously, as we've seen, unfortunately for them, it didn't work out too well. Whereas on the other side that's using Loki as a pawn, I have a feeling they're going to be more successful. So let's look at this other side, shall we? The second group, the Roger Pirates. Well, actually, more specifically, it's Gaban and Shanks. So I think these two ex-Roger Pirates are in cahoots, and that these two have always planned to let Loki go, to release Loki once Luffy came along. Because the Roger Pirates knew the truth about the world, understand the lore, the history, I think they also know that Loki is a core part of what's to come. They know that Loki is the key to the Ragnarok. Ironically, Luffy just fought Scopper for the key to free Loki, whereas actually, Loki is the key to the Great War. He's the key to the Ragnarok that's going to subsequently bring about a new dawn. Thought that was cute. But they also know that Loki's power is one that has to be harnessed correctly. Left on his own, left to his own devices, Loki is too much of a wild card. He's just going to wreak needless havoc. He's just going to destroy the world without proper guidance, without proper focus. If we go back to the Elbafians' interpretations of the Harley and of Nika, Loki is part of those giants that focuses too much on Nika the Destroyer. He doesn't see the bigger picture. Whereas Scopper and Shanks obviously know that Luffy and his new awakened Nika form, he will be the one to properly guide and harness Loki. And that's the reason why Shanks locked up Loki 6 years ago. Despite knowing that Loki wasn't necessarily to blame for killing King Harold, Shanks also knew that it wasn't time for Loki to be going around destroying the world yet. 6 years ago, that was even before Luffy started his journey. In a very similar way, that's the whole point behind Scopper's very recent, very brief clash against Luffy. Apart from Oda just wanting to tease fans with a little brief clash, really what Scopper was doing is he just wanted to test Luffy, and he wanted to confirm with his own eyes that Luffy could be, that he would be the one to harness Loki. Because after first guarding the key, and after warning Luffy that no, you don't want to free Loki, as soon as Scopper sees Luffy's Nika form, he's assured that Luffy is the promised one, the prophesized one, the one that Roger is waiting for, the one that the Roger Pirates were too early for. And we have seen throughout the series that the ex-Roger Pirates, the remnants of the Roger pirates have been very strategically placing themselves throughout the world to guide the one that will one day flip the world upside down. Shanks initially went out going to look for that very person. Crocus waits and sits at Reverse Mountain to welcome the one who is going to enter the Grand Line. Rayleigh waits at the bridge between Paradise and the New World, making sure that the one is ready. And here now, Scopper at Elbaf, another very critical juncture, a land that holds so much of the secrets behind the world's lore, and most importantly, the key to the one who's going to bring about the doom. Scopper stayed here at Elbaf to guard Loki until that right moment. And that right moment has finally come. Luffy, the returned Nika, he's finally arrived to use the key and turn the world upside down. And that, basically, is my idea of what's going on at Elbaf. But Ragnir and Excalibur, two legendary weapons that I believe are going to be hugely important to the series, and that these two are the key in figuring out the secret of what's really going on at Elbaf. So chapter 1141 introduced us or gave us the names of two new weapons, Excalibur and Ragnir. And I'm sure that these are names that many of us recognized almost immediately. But in case you're not aware, Excalibur, which is the name that Oda seems to have given for the sword stuck in Lord Jirul's head, that's the same name of the legendary blade of King Arthur in our real-world mythology. Whereas Ragnir isn't quite as straightforward, but it does seem to be a name that Oda came up with as a combination of the Ragnarok and Mjolnir, both being terms that are heavily associated, heavily important in Norse mythology. And now, we already know that Elbaf is made up of and has been influenced and inspired by a whole suite of historical and mythological elements. And Oda is obviously continuing this with his choice of weapon names. And I'm sure most of you, if you've been following this channel for a while now, you will know that I absolutely love history and love ancient mythologies, so there was no way that I wasn't going to do a deep dive on these two. And let me tell you, the things that I've come away with, the things that I've taken away from this deep dive, these weapons are huge for the series and what they mean for Elbaf. But before we get into all of this, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you're a fellow One Piece fan like me, then you should definitely subscribe so that you don't miss out on more riveting One Piece discussions. Okay, so let's get straight into it, and we're gonna start with Excalibur. So in chapter 1141, Usopp calls the sword that's stuck in Lord Jirul's head Excalibur. And now I've personally taken that at face value, and I've taken that to mean that that means this sword is called Excalibur. That's the sword's name. I just figured that during the feast, Usopp may have asked more about why there's a sword in Jirul's head, what really happened, and I suppose the giants would have explained, oh, that's the legendary sword Excalibur. Lord Jirul was stabbed by it during that tragic battle between Loki and King Harold. And I just suppose that's why Usopp refers to it as Excalibur. However, some of you have said that that may not be the sword's actual name. Maybe Usopp is just making a comparison, given the Arthurian legend does include a tale of a sword, in some accounts called Excalibur, that's stuck in stone, and supposedly not so easy for just anyone to take out. And so perhaps Usopp was just making a mythological illusion, given the comparison of the sword being stuck in Lord Jirul's head. And I won't rule that out as a possibility, but if that is the case, I have to say that has even greater, even huger implications about what that means for the series, because that would mean that there are some real connections between our real life world and the One Piece world. It would mean that folk tales and mythological stories and legends that exist in our real world also exists in the One Piece world. And it's all very meta, but it is somewhat possible because we have, at the end of the day, seen Kuma hold a Bible, carry a Bible, which is obviously a real-life religious artifact that exists for us in our world. So you can let me know which one you believe, whether you think the sword is actually named Excalibur or Usopp is just making a comparison. But either way, I do think this calls for a little explanation of what Excalibur represents in the Arthurian legend. So, in case you didn't know, Excalibur is the mystical, magical sword of King Arthur. King Arthur, in turn, is a mythological hero of many medieval Britain. He's the hero of medieval British literature. King Arthur is said to have been a legendary king, most likely of Celtic origin, who united Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire. After the Romans left Britain, this left a massive power vacuum, and it's said that King Arthur rose during this period, protecting Britain from the Saxons, who were a tribe of people who came from the north, Germanic people who came from the north. And importantly, although King Arthur is widely thought to have been based off a real person, there's actually been no evidence, or at least little to no evidence, to definitively prove that he really did exist. And due to the complicated history of the Arthurian legend, who wrote the tales, when it was written, yada yada yada, there is actually no real canon when it comes to King Arthur, meaning there are lots of different interpretations, lots of different myths. And this is significant when it comes to understanding King Arthur's sword, Excalibur. So depending on which source or which version you read, Excalibur may represent different swords. Some say that Excalibur was the sword that Arthur retrieved or obtained at a very young age, and this is the sword in the stone story. So according to this version, the sword was fixed in stone, and it was prophesied by Merlin that only the one true king would be able to pull the sword out from the stone, and it was Arthur who, as a teenage boy, that achieved this, proving his actual royal heritage. However, according to other sources, this sword that Arthur pulled out from the stone wasn't in fact Excalibur, and was just actually a different sword that Arthur broke quite soon after, and that was how Arthur actually came into possession of the real Excalibur, which according to this version, Arthur received the legendary sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. And according to that version, Excalibur represents and is symbolic of the connection or Arthur's relationship with the mystical, with the fantastical, with, the supernatural. Whereas obviously in the first version, the sword in the stone, there the Excalibur is a symbol of the right to rule, of Arthur's true kingship. And so while I do personally find these various renditions super interesting, for the purposes of its relationship to One Piece, I don't think it actually matters all too much. I don't think it's necessarily relevant that we actually find out which one is correct or which one is the interpretation that we should stick with. As is always the case, Oda's intention when he is influenced and inspired by real-life legends isn't to present a 100% accurate retelling of the legend in his story. Rather, he, picks and chooses what he likes, and he works that into his story in a manner that fits his story. And to me, it seems like Oda has been doing just that when it comes to Excalibur. Even with the very little that we know, I think we can make some connections to the various elements of the Arthurian legend. And the reason why I say this is because there's also another very important element of the sword Excalibur, because according to some accounts of the Arthurian legend, Excalibur is a sword with magical properties. Apparently, the scabbard of Excalibur is able to prevent its wielder from bleeding. The sword is a magical sword that protects its user, stops them from bleeding. And based on that information, hopefully you see where I'm going with this, because to me it seems like that's an element that Oda may have integrated into One Piece. This magical characteristic, this magical property of the sword may just be what's keeping Lord Jirul alive despite being stabbed in the head with the sword. And actually that's exactly what was said in chapter 1141. When drunk Usopp is fooling around and he challenges who can be the one to pull the sword out of Lord Jirul's head, the other giants freak out and they say, you can't do that, otherwise Lord Jirul will die because of blood loss. And sure, from a somewhat scientific point of view, that makes sense, because once the sword gets pulled out, leaves a massive gaping wound, a wound that I'm sure will result in a terrible amount of blood loss. Well, I mean, if we're really looking at a scientific point of view, I'm sure just being stabbed in the head would have killed Jirul already. But upon second look, now that we know this about Excalibur, about the real Arthurian legend, about the real life Arthurian legend, I should say, now I'm thinking when the Elbafians exclaim that pulling out Excalibur would cause Lord Jirul's death from blood loss, maybe what they're really referring to is the sword's magical properties. The fact that it's lodged in his head currently is what's stopping the blood loss from happening. It's keeping further blood loss and further injury at bay. So already we're seeing some of these real life legends that Oda is teasing into Elbaf. Aside from these magical properties, even the fact that the sword is currently lodged in Jirul's head and and that it can't be taken out. Even Usopp joking around and challenging others, who's going to be the one who's capable of taking it out? That all seems very much like a reference to the sword in the stone story. And so these connections, these seeming parallels do make me wonder whether Oda is going to integrate some other elements of Arthurian legend into the story. For example, if King Arthur was the one true king who proved his kingship by being able to pull out the sword, he proved that he was worthy, will we see this happen at Elbaf? I've already seen some people speculating whether this mystical sword will be the power-up that Usopp receives by the end of the Elbafian arc. We've long awaited for Usopp to get a massive power-up where he's finally going to prove that he is a true brave warrior of the seas. And maybe he will prove that he's worthy of being deemed a warrior by being the one able to pull out the sword from Lord Jirul's head. Or maybe it'll actually be Loki. Maybe this is how Loki will be able to prove his innocence by proving that he is a worthy leader of Elbaf, a worthy prince, a worthy king of Elbaf, when he somehow manages to pull out the sword without causing further injury to Lord Jirul. And that about Loki's innocence links back to some other ideas I've had about Loki that I've shared in previous discussions. If you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, I highly recommend you to do so. All of these recent reveals make me more and more convinced that Loki is truly not the bad guy, and that there is something deeper going on in this mysterious feud with his father. And this leads me to the owner of the mystical sword, who owns Excalibur. So according to chapter 1136, Jirul got stabbed in the head during the battle between Loki and his father, the battle that ultimately resulted in King Harold's death. And the way that this is explained, it's clear that the Elbafians obviously blame Loki for what happened. And I think that's resulted in a lot of people reading this to mean Loki was the one who also stabbed Jirul. But I've gone back to reread that chapter and that little piece of dialogue, and I've come to realize that based on that specific wording, they never actually specifically say, they never explicitly say that Loki was the one that stabbed Jirul. It's clear they blamed Loki, but they don't say Loki stabbed Jirul. Meaning that it is very well possible, and I'm even gonna go out and say very likely, that it was actually Harold that stabbed Jirul instead. But obviously, because the Elbafians and Jirul blame Loki for everything that's happened, because they think the battle in the first place was Loki's fault, it just follows that Loki is also at fault for Jirul's injury, even if he wasn't the one that directly caused it. And like I said, I have discussed all of this about what happened between Loki and his father in another video, and there I also pointed out, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's pointed out, that the sword that King Harold is holding in his portrait looks very similar to what's seen of Excalibur. And so that's what's always made me think that King Harold was the one that actually stabbed Jirul, and that the circumstances of the battle aren't quite as they seem, or aren't quite as they've been explained to us. But as of chapter 1141, now that we also know that Loki has a very mighty weapon of his own, Ragnir, which we are going to discuss shortly, this makes me believe even more that it is unlikely that Loki was the one wielding Excalibur, therefore it's unlikely that Loki was the one to have stabbed Jirul. I mean, I think it's quite rare in One Piece for a character to have multiple weapons, or rather, no, let me rephrase that. It's rare for a character to have multiple types of weapons. You're usually a swordsman, or you might be an axeman, or whatever. It's rare that you see someone well-versed in multiple different types of weapons. And I should also state that this is more so the case when the weapon itself is significant. When you have a significant weapon, like it's so significant that it's a named instrument, and that weapon is heavily associated with the character as its wielder, it's rare that you wield another weapon. You know, it would be sort of like if Mihawk started using an axe out of nowhere instead of using Yoru. Or maybe Mihawk is even an extreme example because he's especially known as the world's strongest swordsman. But maybe even if someone like Shanks, instead of using Griffon, starts using a different weapon. And look, it's not impossible. And I guess Loki could just be the ferocious beast that he is because he's so well versed in multiple different weapons, with multiple different weapons. And maybe I'm not explaining that all that clearly, but my point being that King Harold was obviously pictured holding Excalibur, and Loki as one of the Norse gods, owning a weapon that has heavy ties to Norse mythology. I think that makes much more sense, especially because the sword now being named Excalibur, I think that is very fitting and would make a lot more sense considering King Harold's own name, King Harold, because I think that that is also very, very important. So I've always found it really intriguing that King Harold is named King Harold. I've always suspected that this specific name must be a nod to some real-life historical figures, because we do in fact have a number of King Harolds, a number of important King Harolds in our own real-life history, specifically King Harolds who are very central to this medieval time period. So first up we have Harold Fairhair. Harold Fairhair was the first king of Norway who had two sons, get this, known as Eric the Blood Axe, also known as the Brother Slayer, as well as Hakon the Good, and Hakon was known for his unification work, which I have to say does remind me of Haraldin's dream to unite all of the giants. And we'll come back to Harold Fairhair and his two sons a little later, but let's jump forward in our history a little bit and let's look at some other King Harolds that I think might have a little bit more of a direct connection or a more relevant connection to Excalibur. So let's look at King Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England before the Norman invasion, as well as King Harold Hardrada, as well as Harold Hardrada. And now this is going to get a little confusing because these two Harolds share some history. They occupy the same period of history that we have to look at. But just remember that Harold Godwinson of England is Harold with an O, and Harold Hardrada of Norway is Harold with an A. So it's more like Harold and Harald. So this period of history is actually super interesting and there's quite a lot to it. And I highly recommend you to go check it out if you're interested on your own. But for the purposes of this video, for the purposes of finding connections to One Piece, what you should know is that Harold with an O was the king of England, whereas Harold with an A was the king of Norway, and Harold with an A tried to invade England whilst King Harold with an O was king. And this all happened in a very confusing, tumultuous period where King Harold with an O only assumed the British throne following the recent death of his predecessor. King Harold with an A invades England with the help of King Harold with an O's brother. Harold with an O's brother betrays him, sides with Harold with an A, invades England together, but Harold with an O ultimately defeats Harold with an A, marking the death of King Harold with an A of Norway, and historians have considered Harold with an A's death to be the end of the Viking Age. Only 4 weeks later, King Harold with an O is also defeated and faces his own death following the Norman invasion, the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror invades England only weeks later and defeats Harold with an O. And what you should know about Normans are that they are also historically Vikings. Normans are Frenchmen, people from the north who in turn were colonized by Vikings in their history. So I hope you're following all of this. Like I said, it is a little confusing, but the reason why I think that this is actually super important, super relevant for One Piece is because I think Oda has taken some of the various elements of this period in his creation of his own King Harold. So for starters, I think it's important to note that according to the Viz translation, the official translation of the series, Harold of Elbaf is actually King Harold with an A, or he's spelt as King Harold with an A. Now I have seen other translations translate his name as King Harold with an O, but I think it's important here to recognize that the official translation spells it with an A, because I do think it's actually quite relevant when we start to factor in some of this real life history. King Harold with an A was the king of Norway, which has much more of a direct tie to the Vikings, which is obviously relevant because Elbaf is super inspired by Viking history. And so I think this means that we can start looking a little bit more into the connections between King Harold with an A as well as King Harold of Elbaf. For starters, like I mentioned earlier, the death of King Harold marked marked the end, or historians consider that to be the end of the Viking Age. Obviously quite relevant in One Piece because King Harold of Elbaf, he was the one that put an end to the age of Elbafian warriors. King Harold, like of our own real world, in the One Piece world, King Harold too was responsible for the end of the Viking era. But of course, as is always the case with Oda, things are never that simple, and I don't think you can just say, this means that our Harold in Elbaf must be a replica of King Harold in our real world, because it's much more nuanced than that. Again, I think Oda has actually taken bits of the multiple Harolds that have existed throughout history, and I think we can also see that King Harold of Elbaf also exhibits traits of King Harold with an O of England, and I think we can see that by the fact that King Harold of Elbaf has been bestowed Excalibur, or I at least think that King Harold of Elbaf is the true owner, was the original owner, or was the owner of Excalibur and not Loki. When we were first introduced to this sword's name in chapter 1141, I was immediately very curious as to why a sword at Elbaf would have a name that is so closely tied to British medieval history. Whereas now, I really see the connection. If King Harold with an O of England was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, obviously England being where the legend of Excalibur originates, a land that was heavily sought after by the Vikings, by the Normans. And if Excalibur is a sword that represents true kingship, it's quite possible that Oda was drawing from all of this in the creation of his own King Harold. He was drawing on the really messy political, cultural situation that the King of Elbaf seems to have been embroiled in, as well as raising the question of whether King Harold of Elbaf truly deserved to be king. Alternatively, Excalibur may be a sword that the Elbafian giants, stole from another giant kingdom in the past. We know that Elbaf in its past was a violent country that conquered the New World according to Shamrock, and so it's possible that Elbafians stole a legendary sword from a different country, from a different culture. Or who knows, maybe it was a sword that Harold received as a gift, as a token of love from his lover, Harudin's mother. And this might all tie us back into that murky cultural political affairs that I was talking about. King Harold's allegiance, his stewardship of Elbaf, all seems very questionable to me right now. And like I said, I have discussed all of this in another video. I've discussed my suspicions about King Harold's secret plot, who he was really working with, what his race relations with other giants are like. And based off this history of the two King Harolds, the betrayal between brothers, all the different conquests going on, I'm now really inclined to think that King Harold really wasn't the good king of Elbaf that the giants believe him to be. And on this note of King Harold not being such a good guy, I think it's really interesting that King Harold with an A, the one that invaded England, his epithet, Hadrada, that can be loosely translated to hard ruler, ruthless, tough, tyrant. All words that aren't very positive. All words that don't fit the image that the Elbafians have of King Harold, but may in fact be the correct words to actually describe the true nature of King Harold. Or maybe we should actually be looking at Harold Fairhair instead. I mentioned earlier that we were going to go back to him, the first king of Norway, the father of the two brothers, Eric Bloodaxe, aka the Brother Slayer, and Hakon the Good. So quite interestingly, Harold Fairhair is remembered quite fondly to have been the king that united all of Norway to be one kingdom, although some historians believe that Harold Fairhair never really existed. Anyways, this all leads me to believe that Oda was inspired by all of these legendary figures, that he's just gone in and picked and chose little bits and pieces of these different figures. And in this case, King Harold is outwardly a great king who is widely loved and respected by all of Elbaf, remembered very fondly like Harold Fairhair, whereas in reality, in the shadows, things aren't quite as they appear. Obviously, Harold with the two sons, Harudin and Loki, one of them being called the good one, the other one being remembered as this evil. The parallels here are also super clear. So these are some things that I've found and things that I've been thinking about in relation to Excalibur Excalibur and in relation to King Harold. And if this period of history interests you, I would highly recommend another anime/manga series called Vinland Saga. It's all about the Vikings, all about the tumultuous political intrigue, the conquests going on in Scandinavia and in Western Europe. It's very good, so would highly recommend that. And if you're also a fan of Arthurian legend, a book that I read quite recently but has quickly become one of my all-time favorites is a book named The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, a Japanese-British author, and it is only very tangentially related to King Arthur, sort of to serve as a fantasy genre background, but it goes so much deeper than that, and I highly recommend it. Anyways, these are some of the thoughts that I had on Excalibur. Now let's look at Ragnir. So in my opinion, I think Ragnir is a little easier to interpret, apart from the name being not as straightforward, not being a direct one-to-one inspiration, but I don't think it's that hard to interpret. Ragnir seems to be an amalgamation, like I said, of Ragnarok and Mjolnir. So in case you didn't know what either of those are referring to, Ragnarok is the prophesized doom of the Norse world, the Norse mythological world. It said that this is the great event where all of the heroes, all of the gods will die, and that the Norse world will be born again renewed. So this prophesized Ragnarok has some very clear ties to what's going on at Elbaf and what's going on in the world of One Piece. We've known for a while now that there is going to be this great final war, one that's going to bring about the end of the current world as we know it before Luffy brings about the new dawn. And according to this Norse mythology, Loki, who is also a god or a semi-god in Nordic religion, ancient Nordic religion, Loki is said to play a huge role. He's going to be the catalyst for the Ragnarok. So it makes sense that the One Piece Loki now has some pretty explicit ties to the Ragnarok by his weapon. Whereas Mjolnir, interestingly, Mjolnir is the name of the Norse god Thor's hammer, his weapon of choice, his primary weapon of choice. And this is where things get very interesting, because whereas Loki has been a bit of a grey, murky character in Norse mythology, he's not quite good, he's known as the trickster, he's often blamed when things go wrong, whereas Thor on the other hand is a straight up hero. I would actually say that he is the most renowned of all the Nordic gods. He was even more popular than the all-father god Odin himself. Odin was the head of the entire Norse pantheon, and yet the Vikings actually favored Thor on a day-to-day basis. They wore the amulet of his hammer, they wore the Mjolnir sigil, the pendant, as a sign of protection, as a sign of bravery. And so I think we do have to recognize how huge it is, how meaningful it is that Oda seems to have given Loki, as in the Elbafian Loki, some attributes of Thor, the hero. I think that's very telling. And again, this goes back to my speculations about Loki not actually being a bad guy, the fact that he's not evil, the fact that he's been framed. Again, go watch my other video to listen to that discussion at length. But I do think it's very telling that Oda has chosen to give Loki Thor's hammer, a weapon that symbolizes protection and strength, a weapon that symbolizes goodwill. All of these very positive attributes that are now being bestowed upon Loki despite his bad boy image at Elbaf. I also think there is an added layer of meaning if we consider the fact that Mjolnir, similar to Excalibur, has its own test of worthiness. Similar to how Excalibur could only be lifted by the one true king, Mjolnir is also believed to have only been able to be wielded by Thor. My understanding is that there are other figures in Norse mythology that's been able to lift Thor's legendary hammer, but no one could wield it like Thor. Even Odin couldn't wield Mjolnir despite being the head of the pantheon. And so in that case, Mjolnir has this idea of who is worthy to wield such a legendary weapon, which means I think it is very important that Mjolnir is now being associated with Loki, because this is as if Oda is saying Loki is worthy. And the fact that Harold seems to be associated with Excalibur and Loki with Mjolnir, both of these weapons having these legends, having these myths associated associated with value, with worth, who is worthy. I think that's very intriguing. Perhaps we're going to see a case where King Harold's true allegiance is going to be revealed via the Excalibur, via a sword that is potentially not of true Elbafian origin, seeing as Excalibur is actually from England and not from the Scandinavian countries, whereas Loki is going to prove that he is the true Elbafian ruler via the Ragnir, which has a much more direct, has much more heavy ties to Scandinavian history or Scandinavian mythology. I also think that the fact that Mjolnir has these mystical, magical properties of not just responding, of not just being able to be wielded by anyone, I think that's quite important to understanding why Loki now has possession of his weapon. I've seen people call out that the new giant warrior pirates were all just dumb for leaving Loki, someone as dangerous, someone as feared as Loki, with his almighty weapon. Whereas now, I think it makes sense that Elbafians had no choice but to chain up Loki with his weapon because it was physically impossible for them to separate Loki from his weapon. And also, according to Norse mythology, apparently once Mjolnir was thrown, it would always boomerang back, it would always return to Thor. So maybe that also ties into why the Ragnir couldn't be separated from Loki, because even when they tried, the Ragnir would just return to Loki anyways. And in this sense, I think the Ragnir is actually quite similar to another legendary weapon that we've seen in the series, the mighty sword Enma. Enma is such a ferocious sword that has a soul of its own. It's almost like a living being. And we've seen cases of weapons in the story having sort of a will of its own, but that's usually in relation to its devil fruit. Whereas Enma is a case of a weapon that was just so strong that it had a will of its own. And I think we're actually seeing something similar with the Ragnir. The Ragnir is going to be a super strong hammer, a super fierce weapon, so important, so significant that it has a will of its own, and it chose Loki as its rightful master. It recognized Loki as being worthy to wield it. And then adding to all of this, something even more intriguing, something even more interesting is a pretty big case of foreshadowing that Oda served on us in chapter 1141. Ripley mentions that Elbaf's two weaknesses are flames and lightning. And I don't think it is a mistake. I don't think it is an accident. I don't think it is a coincidence that in that very same chapter, we are introduced to this weapon, to this legendary weapon called the Ragnir, with heavy ties to the god Thor, with Thor being the god of thunder according to traditional Norse mythology. So thunder and lightning, I mean, come on. I think we have basically just been told how Loki is going to bring about the Ragnarok, how he is going to bring about the end of Elbaf. And I have to say, I really cannot wait. Anyways, these have been some of my thoughts on the two new weapons, on Excalibur and Ragnir. If you have any thoughts of your own, I'd love to hear it, so leave a comment below. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, please like and share the video. Please also subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future One Piece discussions. I'd also really appreciate your help in getting to 100,000 subscribers. If you'd like to help the channel out further, you can also become a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people. But as always, I just really appreciate you being here. So thank you for listening to another one of my ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.